My name is Margaret Kurth. I work for the Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research and Development Center. I'm here representing myself today. So we have a Superstore panel today of Massachusetts EEA representatives, and they're going to be speaking about best practices for nature-based shore protection in Massachusetts. And that is, they will go ahead and introduce themselves. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia Knisel. I manage the Shoreline and Floodplain team at CZM, and I'm very excited for you all to have stayed here with us to learn about a couple of state and local case studies and also learn about how CZM's Coastal Resilience Grant Program, as well as our Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Grant Program, is really supporting comprehensive management of not only coastal flooding and erosion along our shoreline, but also stormwater as well, in order to make sure that we can still continue to live, work, and recreate along our shore. I want to call your attention to a really important document that came out in 2022, the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment. This document really made a statement that nature-based solutions are going to be a priority for us at the state in order to make sure that our landforms can continue to function. And I want to draw your attention to this example here from Salem. You can see that we have a very historic seawall that is not providing any flood protection for the community any longer, but it is impacting the natural environment. You can see the salt marsh that's really squeezed at the corner there between a public access way and some residential homes. And this is a situation that we're experiencing all across our cities and towns in Massachusetts. We have historic infrastructure that needs to be addressed, and we need to make sure that we're removing some of these human impacts that we have had on the system over time. We have robbed our coastal environments of sediment, we have fixed them in place, and now we need to look at opportunities where we can bring back sediment into the system, use vegetation that thrives in these environments that can really provide the opportunity to trap additional sediment over time, provide stability of the sediment and soils with its root growth, and also provide opportunities to connect with the community so we can build our stewards in these systems to make sure that over time, when there's a decision that needs to be made about helping facilitate the translation of these natural systems, that we actually have the support to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to our team. Tricia Bowie is going to start off by talking about our Coastal Resilience Grant Program. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tricia Bowie. I'm a Coastal Resilience Specialist at CZM. I administer our Coastal Resilience Grant Program. And the grant program really is designed specifically to help communities address local impacts associated with flooding, erosion, and sea level rise, and specifically impacts to vulnerable public facilities and infrastructure. We provide funding and technical assistance to coastal communities, to nonprofit organizations, and most recently we've opened our program up to federally recognized tribes in Massachusetts. So I just want to give a little kind of overview of the program and the types of projects that we fund. We are really interested in working with municipalities to help plan for proactively and adapt to future changes, as well as implement softer shoreline stabilization measures through our program assistance. So I have the project types you can see in the pie graphs here. Since our program was launched in 2014, We've provided over $51 million in total grant funding, and I also want to highlight the significant level of local match that has been provided as part of these projects, over $17 million in local cash and in-kind services. We have also awarded 235 grants in total out of 395 applications that were submitted. So as you can see, shoreline restoration, which encompasses our nature-based approaches, including beach, berm, and dune building, coastal bank stabilization, living breakwater and silt construction, and fringing marsh restoration. That category is our most popular, with $26 million being invested in those projects for 100 different awards. And I just want to kind of clarify that within that category and also within our retrofit and relocation category, it includes projects that come in multiple rounds for subsequent funding for planning, design, permitting, and construction phases. In the first decade of our program, we are really proud of the accomplishments that communities have made. We have funded 28 vulnerability and risk assessments on a local level basis. The grant funding has resulted in hundreds of outreach products. This is in the form of public presentations, maps, story maps, podcasts. We even funded a middle school science curriculum, which was very innovative. We've supported 17 resilience plans, 25 facility and infrastructure retrofits, including the relocation of small buildings, parking lots, and a water main pipe, and a number of other elevation and floodproofing projects. We've restored 21 shorelines. So this is coast-wide again. This covers all of our regions up and down the Massachusetts coast. And we've directly supported 16 environmental justice communities. So I just want to kind of zoom in on the Boston Harbor region. I think what we hear often is that there isn't enough space or room to really implement nature-based approaches, and that is certainly true in some locations, given what Julia said with the amount of hardened shorelines that we have and lack of sediment supply. But what I really want to highlight with this map is that there are opportunities to consider the feasibility and implement those types of approaches. So I have a few projects that have been completed or are in the design and permitting phase. Through our grant program, we've supported projects in Winthrop at Kathleen Park. This was a coastal bank stabilization project. North Nantasket Beach in Hall restored a continuous primary frontal dune. And we'll hear later on Watson Park in Braintree, Antony and Beach. So I'm going to save talking points for those. And then Chelsea and Everett have partnered together for addressing a flood pathway at Island End River. And then there are some other projects that weren't supported by the grant program, but I think good to point out some of the marsh work, marsh restoration work that has included implementation of a small rock sill at the toe of the marsh. So projects that come in for funding typically get funded in phases, beginning with planning, feasibility, and site assessment, which includes an alternatives assessment, design from conceptual designs all the way to final engineering plans, helping communities with local, state, and federal permitting processes, and then construction monitoring and maintenance. So I'll just go over a few lessons learned from projects that we have worked with over the past 10 years through our grant programs. It's really important in the beginning of your planning to think about how the climate impacts are impacting not just your community, but the region. So considering talking with your municipal neighbors, if you are experiencing similar impacts, about how you can join forces to address a larger climate impact and could have a greater benefit. It also gives you the opportunity to leverage resources, shared knowledge, and expertise. It's pretty straightforward, but assembling a really good collaborative team with experience in the type of nature-based approaches you're interested in pursuing. An assessment of the site and upland factors. So looking at the level of flooding that is occurring now and in the future, the sources of erosion and those types of impacts, how the site is exposed to wave energy, tidal range, looking at what wetland resources you have in the area, assessing the grain size, and surrounding infrastructure like utilities that you may have to plan around. We've worked with some projects where we have learned the importance of performing geotechnical work just to get a really good understanding of the subsurface soil composition and stability. Evaluating a range of alternatives, really looking at the pros and cons of each of those that can help lead you to select a preferred feasible alternative, and one that would minimize environmental impacts while balancing other important criteria. We heard the importance this morning in the keynote speakers' presentations about engaging with community members and really understanding how they use and access the site and what they find valuable about the site. For design and permitting, this is really site-specific, and we'll get into the details with the case studies that follow, but really making sure that that design is well-suited to the site conditions. I really recommend trying to be adaptive during your design process. We've had projects where during the middle of the design, a storm will come along and would require the team to go back and redesign some of those changes that happened. And with permitting, that really is project specific, but consulting with permitting agencies in advance of submitting applications, providing full and complete information to really help smooth the process and make it go as fast as it can. And for construction monitoring and maintenance, providing oversight, retesting grain size if necessary for beach berm and dune restoration projects. Plantings are a very important part of these projects, so choosing vegetation that is appropriate to the conditions, understanding how the plants can tolerate salt spray, tidal inundation, wind and waves, planting in early spring to give them the best chance of survival, and irrigating if necessary, and protecting those areas from foot traffic so that they can have a greater chance of establishing. And developing robust monitoring and maintenance plans. This is typically part of the permitting process when you're submitting those plans. And we've learned that sometimes those don't have the level of detail that you need to actually go out in the field and execute appropriately. So thinking very robust about the methods that you do need to really look at each component of the living shoreline system so that you can identify issues early on, intercept those, and adaptively manage. Okay.
Good job, Tricia. All right. Hi, everybody. Are you all right? Okay, Good. Before I start to talk, I just want to acknowledge all of my colleagues from the City of Boston, whether you're here from the Environment Department, Planning Department, some other department, because this project is a true collaboration between the Department of Conservation and Recreation and the City of Boston, who actually really dragged us to this grant opportunity, willingly, of course, but we partnered with the City of Boston, who applied for the CZM Coastal Resiliency Grant to get us going on this particular project. So I'll talk a little bit about this Conley Street in Tinian as an example. So what you're looking at here, and if there wasn't so many of you, we actually joked about going out into the hallway because you can see this site from the end of the hallway. So Conley Street and Tinian are right next to sort of the gas tank, a little bit to its left from here. So anyways, this is a 10-acre state reservation. And as you can see by this map, this is the 2030 1% storm inundation. And what you can see is this really interesting little flood pathway that goes underneath the I-93 overpass into a portion of the Dorchester community. And just a couple of features about this area is that it has about 356 households. The majority of the housing stock in this particular flood pathway neighborhood is multi-family and high-density residential. And it has an estimated $36 million worth of damage to that 20-31% storm. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be neat if we could eliminate that flood pathway into Boston? And it also affects Morrissey Boulevard, which is a DCR roadway as well. So the $36 million in avoided losses really includes protecting those buildings and residences, but also some of these core transportation roadways. All right. So just a little bit in the overall sort of design proposal. So essentially, we were looking at a way to preserve the parkland features. This is a really important sort of recreational space right along the waterfront. It's vibrant. It has a really great brand new playground that was opened in 2019 that was actually relocated from a closer sort of sandy spot up the hill a little bit. But we really wanted to be able to preserve a couple of really key important features. As a state parks agency, recreation is the R in our title, and so it's really important that we balance those sort of benefits of this space. And one important feature here is the connection of the Neponset River Greenway, which if you're from the region, you'll know that we just completed a segment that brings the Neponset River Greenway right to the other side of the bridge. And we're going to, with this project, continue that a little bit further. But we're moving the Greenway back from its current location to a higher elevation and moving it away from the shoreline. And just another perspective, so you can see some of those features here. A big component of this particular project is to restore and expand the marsh right along the coastline. It's a highly degraded, low-lying area. There's also a lot of issues that we're having with some stormwater, which we're also trying to work on with this project by removing a significant portion of the parking lot by making parking available along the street, which will be elevated, and then leaving a small parking area for those recreational amenities. All right, so this is just a typical cross-section throughout the area, and you'll notice that this particular design that we're going with is to address the 2030 1% storm. And that is one of those sort of early, sort of near-term flood pathway projects through Climate Ready Boston, but really the important thing for us to keep in mind was how can we make this project adaptable over time as well. So we realized we have a really important near-term issue here. This site floods monthly through monthly high tide cycles as it is, but when we do experience storm conditions, how can we immediately make that design occur and then also be able to add to it in the future. So I just wanted to show an example of what we would do to sort of add additional height, either through adding some berm throughout the parking area, the new Neponset River Greenway that'll be closer to the street, or adding an additional 2 or 3 feet to Conley Street itself. An important aspect of this project is that Conley Street is used as a major access point to Port Norfolk neighborhood. And so we wanted to make sure that we were creating a project that tried to allow for the roadway to be able to be maintained as much as possible during storm conditions. And then I'm gonna just end with a couple of photographs here. So this is just today at Tinian, and then a bird's eye view of what we hope to see, a restored shoreline with some beach nourishment, as well as some new recreational amenities and features and a new Neponset River Greenway as soon as we can figure out how to restore funding, which we no longer have, but we will persevere, and that is all I have, so great.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Haney. I'm a coastal geologist with the Office of Coastal Zone Management. I'm talking about the Watson Park project. So Watson Park is located just behind Weymouth and Quincy. This little view of Boston Harbor on the left, and then zoomed in a little bit to the Fore River area. Watson Park is tucked way up in the Fore River. And the vulnerabilities that we addressed at Watson Park were that we had 3 different issues. So there was the flood risk, which the tan shows you the FEMA 1% chance flood layer for Watson Park. You can see most of it is underwater. And the top right shows you March 2018 reality check. Yes, it all does flood. So they came in and asked for some help. They also had, in addition to the flooding issue, they have erosion as well along the shoreline. There was erosion on either side of the stormwater head wall that was contributing to, they were losing, that was threatening the, obviously the park, but also the stormwater infrastructure there. So the stormwater infrastructure, the head wall was failing, and there were some challenges with the volume of water coming out in that location. So the alternatives that they looked at for those 3 different issues, starting with stormwater, looked at creating a forebay just inshore of the shoreline there to try to slow down the floodwaters before it went out at the shoreline. That was considered a bit of a public safety issue in a public park, so that was ruled out. They did look at extending the pipe and possibly restoring the salt marsh along the shoreline. That had some other challenges, and so we looked at trying to make sure that we're addressing the stormwater up gradient of the park and infiltrating it before it comes out to the shoreline to really address that being one of the major causes of the erosion along the shoreline. So for the flood protection, there was a small existing seawall, which is the darker gray on the lower left there. We looked at the possibility of extending the seawall. It's not really a preferred alternative for our park because there are other options. So we did look at, or the project looked at, creating a berm and tying that into the seawall and providing the flood protection in that way. So the berm was a more friendly option that can blend into the park well. So for the flood protection, those were the 2 main alternatives. The bank stabilization, you saw the erosion on either side of the head wall. We looked at a range of different alternatives with the bioengineering on the bank, which you can see the dotted line is the existing scarped oversteepened bank. So the option was to cut back the slope to a stable slope, putting natural fiber blankets and vegetate with possibly some coir rolls at the toe. And there was unvegetated peat on the tidal flat that we could bring up in elevation and restore the salt marsh. So that was one alternative. Also looked at terraces, gabion terraces on the bank with the salt marsh restoration in front. So there was quite a suite of alternatives to address these 3 different issues. The recommended design came out with salt marsh restoration on either side, up gradient and down gradient of the stormwater outfall. And then the rocky intertidal enhancement right in front of the outfall to help slow down the floodwaters, reducing the stormwater volume up gradient of the park so we have less coming to the shoreline and contributing to the erosion, repairing and retrofitting the stormwater pipes, putting in some check valves to help with the stormwater. And then coastal bank stabilization with the bioengineering on either side of the head wall. We're also, the alternative included installing the earthen berm at the top of the coastal bank to provide that flood protection from a 50-year event under current sea levels, and installing 3 rain gardens on the landward side of the berm to be able to infiltrate the floodwaters and stormwater. So that's the general idea of what it looks like in cross-section. The one key element in there is also a fence to make sure that we're keeping pedestrians from going down the bank, because that was also contributing to the erosion. In plan view, you can see the berm snakes along on either side of the park, tying into the seawall in the middle. So there's a gap in the middle, that's where the seawall is. But the berm ties into elevation 10 on either end. And that's key to be able to tie in and not have floodwater going around it or causing other issues. So it does taper in at both ends. The pink are the 3 rain gardens. And then there's a zoom in of the conceptual design, giving you the 8-minute speed snapshot here. So one important thing about the marsh restoration was there's a lot of challenges with trying to add volume and provide some kind of protection for it while the vegetation gets established. And with our tide range, it's very hard to, if you start to get into bigger structures, you get a lot more end effects and a lot more scour and other unintended consequences. Because this location is so sheltered, we were able to look at doing sills here, but we also wanted to make sure that they weren't too big, that they weren't going to have those unintended impacts. And so in the foreground is the high marsh that was installed. The unvegetated peat flat was a little bit higher on that side, so we could do high marsh. On the other side, it's already underwater at this tide stage because we only installed low marsh there. And that's a tricky balance to make sure that you're not trying to over-engineer something to build up something that's going to be causing other unintended consequences. There is a very detailed monitoring and maintenance program associated with it, making sure that the marsh gets established is something that took some care and feeding. So the quarterly monitoring by the community and then the yearly monitoring with a consultant was important to identify what we needed to do for adaptive management. And so the grant funding did continue and do the first 4 years of the monitoring and the adaptive management. Management included, first of all, there's a very healthy goose population that loves that park. They also thought new vegetation was a great thing to feed on. It was salad for lunch. So goose fencing was absolutely critical to keeping the geese out of the salt marsh. We did need to do some repair of sinkholes. There was some need to bring some elevations back up. There was some upland drainage causing some erosion, and replanting of marsh species has been necessary in the marsh restoration area. It was installed in 2022. It's been necessary the last 3 springs, and that's been tweaking the plants each time to recognize what's thriving where. We also had to tweak the plants on the bank because the high tides were a little bit higher than originally anticipated. So one of the main questions I get about the sill is, how it was approved, because sills are not something that we see a lot of. We do have concerns about how those are installed and making sure that we're not putting them in places that are going to have unintended consequences. So the key factors for this location were the wave climate. This is way up the river. There's the only waves are the wake from the boats in the marina. So it has a very limited fetch. The stormwater outfall impacts were pretty significant here, and there really wasn't an option to move it elsewhere. So putting that, taking as much stormwater upgrading is the best way to deal with that. But we needed to make sure that we addressed the we needed to make sure we were also looked at what other resources were on site. So making sure there's no shellfish, no attached macroalgae, using that unvegetated peat shelf that's there already, and minimizing those impacts. So that's the quick overview of Watson Park. Oops. Sorry.
All right, so Rebecca talked about that important stormwater question at Watson Park in the outfall, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But first, hi everyone, my name is Kathleen Mason. I'm with the Coastal Habitat and Water Quality team at CZM, and I administer the Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Grant Program. So I can't help but plug the program. We have a spring RFR that's set to release soon, so as I'm going through a few project examples, if there's anything that you feel like aligns with the project that you're working on or an upcoming project or project idea, please reach out soon before the RFR comes out. And in the sake of time, I'm going to skip over our sort of eligible project categories that I have listed here, but ultimately the goal of the program is to protect and restore coastal habitat and water quality across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So going back to stormwater, I really like stormwater, and I think it's really important. And it's definitely a really important component for you to think about in your projects, projects that aren't just looking at stormwater themselves. So we focus on stormwater as part of our coastal habitat and water quality team, but stormwater also crosses into our coastal resilience team, as you've seen in these projects. So it's definitely important to think about as you consider the best management options at your, thinking about all the impacts that are happening on your sites. So going to the Watson Park project, which Rebecca just spoke of. So again, you can see this sort of upland residential area of the park, and all that stormwater was being collected in pipes and being sent downstream out of that outfall. So you were seeing photos earlier of the erosion that was occurring at the outfall. So the town needed some better solutions to reduce the flow out of the outfall to therefore reduce the erosion. So through the Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Grant, they assessed the best options and came up with some designs. And those are zoom-ins of the park itself. So they decided to go with a stormwater infiltration system, so sort of a subsurface system, to collect that water from the neighborhoods and sort of better infiltrate it and reduce the flow out of the outfall. They later went to Mass DEP 319 grants for the implementation funding to implement it. So that was just a key component in making sure that the work that was previously done was still going to work well and still protect the coastal resources. Touching on another project up on the North Shore in Winter Island Park in Salem. This park is right up against Salem Sound. And it is a really large parking lot in the park, and it had no stormwater infrastructure. So ponding would occur, and then the parking lot was graded, so all the floodwater and stormwater would go directly into the harbor, really scouring and creating erosion in the coastal bank in the beach, and you can see that in that photo there. So the town needed to figure out what to do. So they wanted to redirect the flow and ultimately reduce that erosion. So they came in for a Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Grant to sort of assess and design and implement this system here. And so this is a biofiltration system with pretreatment, or like a rain garden basically. You can see it in that photo there, and they tilted the parking lot towards this system to collect, treat, and infiltrate the water there instead of sending it off and scouring the coastal beach bank. So this system works great now, and you can see that the erosion was gone in those photos too. And as part of the Coastal Habitat and Water Quality Grant, we also fund habitat projects. And so this is just an example that I have to share too. This is based in Mattapoisett and the Mattapoisett Neck Salt Marsh System. They came into our grant for a comprehensive habitat restoration plan. So they looked at all the stressors in their marsh system, the impacts, and then created some feasible restoration options for short and long-term solutions and prioritized those and created a list of recommendations. So some of those recommendations came out of stormwater management and sort of like an upland area of the marsh system. They looked at sort of more assessment on ponding on the top of the marsh system, and they also looked at a culvert replacement. So in this photo, you can see this is Molly's Cove, they call it, and that culvert there, which sits under Mattapoisett Neck Road, needed to be replaced to both help with, to maintain the integrity of that road going out to a neighborhood, as well as help the salt marsh system restore as well. So that was a recommendation coming out of it, and that's currently seeking other funding at this point. So thanks for letting me share a little bit about the grant program, and feel free to reach out, and I'll kick it to Julia.
Well, thank you, team. As we wrap up and transition into discussion, I do want to point out 2 resources that we have on CZM's website. The first is our Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Viewer. This tool is set up so that you can look at historic storm events in your community or area of work, as well as looking forward at future tidal conditions and storm surge with elevated tides. The other tool that I'll point out is our series of fact sheets, where we touch on a lot of these nature-based approaches and discuss what you need to look at in terms of your site as far as suitability for nature-based approaches, and then also getting into some more details in order to work your project through design and permitting. So with that, we want to hear your questions and have a good discussion for the next 10 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much. I thought I would go ahead and just kick it off with one question that I have. So I'm associated with the Engineering with Nature program, and one thing we're doing is developing design guidelines for different types of nature-based solutions. And during the presentations, I was thinking about the kind of at least 10 years at a minimum really, of experience in Massachusetts with giving out grants for nature-based solutions and for different shoreline restoration projects. And so I wonder, in the spirit of kind of best practices and lessons learned, across those 10 years, have you seen different best practices? And I'm sure you have, but are they being rolled up in any way, or have they been used to create any sort of guidelines or, just general sort of reports like that?
I can start us off. I want to highlight some work that we're doing with the other coastal programs in New England, as well as our federal partners. So through the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, we have been working over the last 5+ years with NOAA funding and nonprofit partners to really make sure that we're expanding the implementation of nature-based approaches in the region, and to uncover those best practices and get them into some resources for people that are looking to implement these projects. So we have some documents up on the Northeast Regional Ocean Council's website under their Living Shoreline work group. So I do want to encourage you to go there, but we can speak to our experience here in Massachusetts to say that early on with the grant program, we were really focused on beach and dune nourishment because we had a lot of vulnerable systems that desperately needed that infusion of sediment and needed that buffering in front of our failing seawalls. But now as the program has grown, we are expanding up into other environments that aren't as attacked by waves during northeast storms and have the ability to consider different types of approaches, as we've talked about with our case studies here. And I think that's really the most interesting piece, is that where we can use a lot of different types of approaches, so you have different habitat types, providing different functions for the system, and providing the benefits for the community in terms of water quality, recreation, and others.
I'll also just mention another resource. In one of my slides, I had the map with the little dots, and all of those were project locations that we have mapped on a grant viewer. So if you Google CZM grant viewer, it should come up. And also a request, if anybody out there has worked on a grant project and has a project webpage that they would like to share with us, please reach out, because we do provide the direct link from the grant viewer to project web pages where communities can host deliverables from the grants that they worked on. So that's been one of our main ways of trying to increase the transferability of projects. That is one resource. We are working hard to keep that up to date as best as we can. Yeah, project web pages are one places where you can go to find final reports and deliverables. We also require, as part of our grant program, that the applicants or the grantees provide a case study report. So we're trying to kind of gather all of that data and synthesize it, and hopefully we can get some more information on our website up as well.
Great. Let's open it up, and I'm not sure if we need mics or if we should shout, but any questions for the panel? Sure. First in the back.
Wonderful presentations. Oh, thank you. Thank you so very much for the wonderful presentations. I enjoyed that. Now, I see a lot of work, especially looking at particularly like, stormwater runoff, at the same time looking at vegetation and so on. Now, my question is, are there any studies going on looking at perhaps emerging pollutants that are present in the water or in this, the runoff? Emerging pollutants like microplastics, PFAS?
I think there are emerging studies going on. There's nothing that we have directly worked on that I'm aware of. Our grant program does target contaminants of concern based on the Mass DEP integrated list of waters. So if there are, if someone's proposing a solution that's addressing a contaminant that's on that list, then I think that's a good go. But we aren't actively doing anything with contaminants emerging contaminants at this time.
Afterward, we can point you to some resources from DEP.
You had a question in the front?
Yeah, so mostly, I guess, on a larger scale, to what you presented, Julia, for the entire course, I think it was really useful to see sort of examples of success stories along. Sorry about that. It was really critically important to see success stories in terms of all the initiatives that have been funded up and down the coast. And I was particularly struck by the example you presented, Sarah, on the DCR owned property. And I guess my question is, hopefully we'll find the resources and the funding to keep these projects going. But in the near term, which I would say 2 to 6 years, not specifically saying 4 years, where do you see opportunities in terms of leveraging partnerships, but additional resources to get these communities to invest in these nature-based solutions, and also have conversations maybe about letting nature take spaces that it needs to take over and have communities potentially relocate to higher ground?
Oh, yeah, you seem like you had something really good to say.
I just wanted to point out a resource that our executive office is working on, and that's a climate finance study. So that has a lot of different mechanisms to not just rely on state and federal funding for implementation of projects, but to generate new revenue and to really work more closely with the private sector. And I want to say that the EEA finance team is growing with expertise in economics and finance to really help like move that project when it comes out to implementation.
Thank you for saying that. I was going to say that too. What I wanted to add was to the second part of your question, which I think was a little bit like, what about leaving it alone? And just sort of, are there opportunities to do that? So certainly in an urban, sort of developed shoreline, letting it flood is not really an option for this neighborhood. We have too many, homes and businesses to protect here. But I will share that we are doing a pilot project at Demarest Lloyd, which is one of our state reservations in Dartmouth. We actually just started, where we're going to look at an opportunity to do a phased retreat project there. And so I think that we're starting to enter this space of being able to work with communities, to be able to work with our properties, to think about how we can intentionally plan to be able to move back infrastructure rather than moving, to fortify a shoreline or something, because it doesn't necessarily make sense in all cases. And so looking for that balance.
We have to move on to the next panel. I'm sorry that we didn't get time for more questions. But of course, these lovely panelists are all around today, at least, and maybe for some more of the conference too. So let's give them a round of applause.